Hi, my name is Srishti, and I'm going to be talking to you today about a few strategies that might be helpful for teams during prep time. A lot of these are specifically directed for EUDC or an international, but obviously they are probably strategies that you're more or less already aware of or have used in the past. Um, I think the key thing that I want to point out right at the start is the obvious caveat that everything I've said, everything I'm going to say so far, or everything I've said so far, and indeed everything I'm going to say today, are things that have worked for me personally or have been gleaned from workshops that I have been in terms of strategies that people have in general found useful. So a lot of this will depend, or the specifics of it will depend on how you work with your partner or what your team dynamics are. I will have a section on that towards the end. So essentially what I wanted to talk to you today about was, first of all, some general things to bear in mind in terms of, you could call it a checklist or things that you should definitely have, irrespective of the position you're in or the side of the debate you're in. Then I'll have some more specific things to bear in mind for different kinds of debates, so regrets debates, hypothetical debates, fact-heavy debates. Then I will look at the specifics of top half and bottom half and what you might want to do in either situation and how they might differ. And finally, I think I want to end with some general strategies for how to work with your partner during prep time, and specifically how you might want to adapt your team dynamics at an international. So some of you will have been at an international before. I certainly found it a bewildering experience when I attended Worlds for the first time. And I definitely think there are some things that are slightly different compared to a regular IB or an open. So those are some things I want to talk about today. And I'm not very good with technology, but I think you should be able to type up questions somewhere on YouTube, and I will answer them if you. And I'll also sort of just make sure that I'm trying to incorporate any questions you might have into the structure that I have for my workshop. Okay, so the first thing, in terms of a general bear in mind about, irrespective of the kind of motion it is or the position that you're in. The first thing I would say, and I think this is fairly obvious, but surprisingly, it's something that people often forget to do, which is almost, and I prefer to do it almost before I start prepping the case for my side, is to find out or to discuss with your partner for a couple of minutes what you think the strongest line of argumentation from the op is, or from whatever side you're not part of. Which is to say that if you're faced with an absolutely sensational opposing team, what are the arguments that they might bring to the table? Now, some of this might be strategic in the sense that if you are familiar with that team, you might know the kinds of arguments that they tend to run. But in general, what you want to do, almost even before you begin to construct your own case, is to think about what the best lines of arguments for this particular motion might be from the other side. Now, the reason why this is important is because very often, because prep time is only for 15 minutes, and obviously you spend some of that, going to rooms, etc. So when you're faced with having to construct a complex case for yourself in under 15 minutes, you are so focused on trying to come up with the best case for your own side, of trying to shoehorn the mechanism to fit the impacts that you want, that you almost forget the ways in which your case might be vulnerable in slightly non-intuitive ways. So what I would suggest is, very briefly, maybe just for a minute and a half or 2 minutes, come up with the best possible arguments you think might be brought forward by an opposing team. The other thing to think about here is also what are some other pitfalls that you might want to avoid going into your own positive case construction, which is to say, the way this was explained to me when I was in first year was, if someone could ask you a case, if someone could ask you a POI that was absolutely devastating, that just destroyed your case, what would that POI be? Think about that POI that devastates your case, and then make sure that you're making a case that's robust, that can withstand said POI. The reason why you might also want to do this is because, as the case, particularly if you're in top half, as the debate goes on, you begin to lose control of your case in some way, right? Because you don't really get to talk about your case a lot more. So it is vital, irrespective of the position you're in, but particularly in top half, that you're able to anticipate the kind of vulnerabilities that your case might later be subjected to. If you're on opposition, first of all, try and think about, obviously do this, think about what the strongest prop line is, or what the benefits they want to bring to the table are. But what you might also want to try and do is to discuss very quickly what kinds of clarifications you might want to get in early. So things that you think are really necessary almost before you decide which particular tack on opposition you're going to take. The other thing you should do is to come up with your own devastating POIs, so that you can try and see if you can extract early concessions from the team against you. This is also true if you're in bottom halves, if you're in closing up, so you don't actually get into the debate meaningfully until quite late in the play. So what you want to try and do is to make sure that you have begun to think of POIs that might be really important to try and extract concessions from the government case, or try and damage their principle very early on, or to try and push them into a corner where they're willing to defend more than the motion actually requires them to defend, etc. So from this point onwards, when it comes to positive material constructions, I think this bit is probably fairly obvious, but there are a few key pitfalls that you might wish to avoid. So I think this is something that most teams already do, which is, first of all, you might want to figure out what exactly is the problem that the motion is trying to fix. So very often, for example, one of the debates I can think of for this is regretting something like regretting the narrative that regretting the pursuit of social mobility, or something of that sort, or regretting the narrative that social mobility is good, or something. So with a motion like that, it's not immediately intuitive on prop why social mobility might be a bad thing, or certainly why wishing to make your life better might be a bad thing. So I think what you need to try and do there is to try and figure out, well, sometimes the problem will be obvious, right? So with a lot of, say, intervention type debates, the problem is that you want to stop a civil war, you want to save lives. So with things like that, the problems are fairly simple. What happens where you can't figure out what the problem is? I think a cheat code for this, which is not always helpful, but sometimes is to try and think of what kind of a debate the CA team might want you to have. So why is it that they have chosen this particular set of ideas, and what do they think the clashes in these ideas are? So essentially try and think of the world that will emerge as a result, the world as it is now, and the world that will emerge as a result of the introduction of this policy, or this, I don't know, narrative, I suppose. The second thing you must remember to try and do during prep time is specifically why this policy and no other is the one that you're defending in pursuit of solving this problem. So bearing in mind that very often in proposition, we say this policy might be effective or something, and then opposition will say, but here is a better policy, or here is a set of other ideas that you may wish to consider. So quite apart from how this policy will work, you want to also want to spend some time talking about why specifically this policy and no other is the one that you want to focus on. The third thing, and this is quite important, is to think about the costs of this policy. On proposition, you may say that those costs are legitimate, or when I say costs, I mean in terms of obviously not merely in terms of expenses, but in terms of, say, other kinds of resources or harms that will accrue as a result of pursuing the good outcomes of this policy, etc. So you may wish to also decide then, what is your strategy going to be with respect to these costs? If you're an op, you may say that those costs are illegitimate or they're too high a price to pay. On op, you may say that they are legitimate, or you may wish to come up with further argumentation as to how you would mitigate those costs. An example of this might be with a motion like allowing doctors to opt out of specific medical procedures on the basis of their conscience. Bearing in mind what you think the cost of this debate is, or what the harms that, or what the cost of this policy is, or what the harms that might accrue are, the debate can take very different directions, right? So for example, if you say that this will make religious people feel on the basis of their religion or their conscience, this will make religious people feel disconnected from the state because they think the state doesn't care. That's one kind of harm, and then the weighing up becomes very different. On the other hand, if you think that there will be a vast number of doctors who, if you did not allow them to opt out of a procedure on the basis of their religion, might just cease practicing, then that's a different kind of harm, right? Because then that's a harm specific to present and future patients of the doctor. So what you might want to do is to, on proposition, decide why those costs are legitimate, or what are some ways in which you can mitigate them, or indeed some ways in which you might be able to minimize them. And on op, you might want to say why those costs will definitely occur and why they are too high and therefore too illegitimate. So the next thing you might want to do is to, or the next thing you should try and think about doing is to think about all the various actors who might be affected as a result of this policy. The reason why this is important is, and I'll go into it in a little bit more detail when I do specific strategies for top and bottom halves. But on top half, bearing in mind that you finish your speeches much quicker. You finish your speeches much earlier than anybody than anyone in bottom half. So you don't want the debate to run away from you. So essentially, you want to be able to anticipate all of the different people or all of the different groups of people or organizations or institutions or countries that this debate might possibly affect. And therefore, even if you're not able to talk about all of them, to be able to do enough work on at least the most significant ones so that your bottom half team is not able to then say they only mentioned this particular actor, but this actor is the most important one in the debate. Obviously, if you're in bottom half, the reason why this is important is because top half will probably take most of the obvious material. So you want to make sure that you are prepared to talk about anyone else who's remaining. So remember, quite apart from, the problem that this policy is seeking to solve, the costs that might incur, also to try and think about all the different actors who this particular policy might affect. As a continuation of this, another thing to add to your checklist is to see if this policy might be an extension of something that we already do. Because if you do so, then you might be able to borrow some argumentation from a different debate or from a different instance in real life. As an example of this, recently at a tournament, and indeed I believe a motion that was included in the IA test, the IA test, I think, was a motion on presuming you live in a world where happiness can be measured and can be accurately measured and transferred. This house would progressively tax and redistribute happiness. Now, obviously, that's a hypothetical debate, but there are also other debates, for example, about specific policies that you want, corporations to undertake or charities to undertake, or different kinds of funding outcomes, and so on. So even where the policy is a new one that you haven't heard of before, is a hypothetical one, so it doesn't exist at all or cannot exist, the thing you want to try and see is if it bears any fidelity with something that exists already, or something that you might be familiar with. For instance, what is the logic of taxation that you believe in for income, and why is this similar or different? So the reason why you want to do that is because, as I said, first of all, because you can then use it to come up with a set of arguments that are proximate to the arguments that you might want to make for this particular motion. But again, it also helps you avoid the kinds of it also helps you anticipate the objections that the other team might have to said argument. So the thing that you want to do is, in general, irrespective of if you do find a policy that is proximate to the one that you have to defend, is to try and talk about, on proposition in particular, the ways in which your policy is similar to that, or the way in which it might be an extension of a policy that already exists in the real world. The reason for that is that it allows you to then convince your panel that this is a continuation of a set of ideas that we find legitimate. Hello. That are already in practice, and therefore it might be in fact inconsistent to not have this policy, or to not tax happiness, or not redistribute it in a world where we already tax income, depending on the side you're on. So that's always a useful thing to try and add to your prep kit, particularly for motions where it might be a slightly non-intuitive policy, or even if it is an intuitive one, it always helps. The next thing to add to your checklist is examples. This is obviously, I mean, this one is trivial, I think, but I think what's important is, particularly in a lot of debates that require you to discuss IR, particularly about unfamiliar, geographically slightly less familiar or unfamiliar areas for you, is be very careful about the kinds of examples that you're using. If you're talking about a policy that is, used in a particular country, and then what you want to do is to apply it to a different set of countries, the check you should apply for the set of examples that you've come up with is, are the circumstances similar enough that you will be able to replicate these effects with some meaningful degree of control? So are the countries, similar at all? So if there is a particular, incredibly progressive, socially progressive policy that works in, say, Sweden, for instance, will you be able to then use it, will you then be able to use that policy across the rest of the world, across the rest of Western liberal democracies? So when you, for example, say, we already do this in X, or we think this will be like X, try and think about what possible responses might come out of opposition in terms of similarity, or in terms of maps that you can draw for how a policy must be enacted. The other thing to bear in mind is, and this will become, I think this is important both for the individual speaker, but also something for you to agree on as a team during prep time, is to ensure that you are very clear about what your characterization of different aspects of your case are. So for example, have you described accurately what you think the problem is? So for example, if it is a debate about a particular, I don't know, making trade unions for a particular group of people compulsory, or reforming trade unions in a particular way, have you agreed across both speakers? So this is something that definitely need to do during prep time. What exactly your understanding of trade unions under status quo is. So do you think they are a good thing in need of reform? Do you think there are problems that might be exacerbated as a result of this policy? Do you think they're broadly helpful and therefore should be extended to this particular vulnerable group? And so on and so forth. So make sure that across both speeches, because this often becomes a sticking point, that you agree on a characterization of the problem or of the world as it stands at the moment. Have you then also agreed on a characterization of the costs and why you think they are legitimate or can be minimized, or they're not really something you care about anyway, etc. And finally, have you agreed on a characterization of the impacts? So make sure that when, and I mean, this is a lot of descriptive work that you will need to do as part of your actual speeches. Make sure that you agree upon what the most important bits of the impact are that you absolutely must describe in order to win the debate. Therefore, during prep, work through the characterization of that particular set of impacts. The next thing that I want to talk about is specific to, is to essentially make sure that your case is ironclad, right? Read all the words in the motion. And I apologize if this sounds a bit patronizing. It's not meant to be. The reason why I say this is because CA teams spend a lot of time trying to come up with the right words for the kind of debate they wish to have, and they're very conscientious about it. And obviously, you know, they might get I don't know, interpretations of the motion or whatever. But it's safe to assume that, you know, every word in the motion is there because it performs a very specific function. So what you want to try and do is to make sure that you read every part of the motion very, very carefully so that you can generate arguments on either prop or op that are specific to the version of the motion that you have to debate, as opposed to, say, general debates of the area, general arguments of the area that you might be familiar with. So for example, why is it that a specific actor has been chosen as the focus of the motion, even if it's a beliefs motion? It's not a, you know, this house as America would X, right? So bear in mind that there is a reason why that particular actor has been chosen. You know, is it the ICC? Is it, I don't know, the NAACP? Is it a particular legal body? Is it a particular group of people? Is it a particular country, etc.? So make sure that the arguments that you are producing are sensitive to the specificity of the actors that have been mentioned in the motion. The second thing to bear in mind, this is, I think, more useful for op than on prop, but certainly something to be aware of, is that sometimes there will be adverbs and adjectives added to the motion, to the wording of the motion. Bear in mind that that often indicates the degree to which you want a particular policy defended, or a very specific set of outcomes that you wish to achieve. So for example, if a motion says aggressively redistribute, that means aggressively, right? So if your prop team has tried to come up with a soft version of the prop, that is a legitimate line of attack to say that they don't fully meet the remit of the motion. Or for example, there was, I think, a motion some time back about, it was a motion on war, I believe, that had the words, you know, supports the unfettered criticism of something. or the unfettered and constant criticism of something, right? So again, then, on opposition, you may wish to suggest why it is that even if criticism of that particular actor is legitimate, what Prop's burden is to defend constant and unfettered criticism, right? So Prop can't then choose to say that strategically we will criticize this because overwhelmingly it's bad, or or this actor has done more harm than good. And obviously, if you're on Prop, the thing you need to try and remember is why is it that criticism must be unfettered or redistribution must be aggressive and so on. One very easy way to try and think about this in Prop is to say that the scale of the problem is so large that the only way in which you can expect to have any meaningful discursive change is if you have a total pushback against that particular actor, right? Which is why it must be unfettered or whatever. But bear in mind that that is something that you need to include as part of your case. Even if it is not a substantial part of your case, your case definitely needs to be sensitive to the demands of the motion. The next thing to bear in mind in continuation with paying attention to the words of the motion is, does the motion imply a specific characterization of the world in which the debate is set, or a specific characterization of the groups it wants you to talk about? My favorite example of this is the open quarterfinal at Tallinn Euros, which was about Indian women's rights movements co-opting the images of violent Hindu goddesses as part of their activism. My team, my partner and I were in closing op, and so we didn't really get to make a very big deal out of it. But throughout the debate, there was a great degree of focus on how feminism is seen as a Western movement, and therefore, if sort of Indian feminists adopted a mythology or an iconography that is more familiar with the people who they represent or the people they're fighting for, this neutralizes the Westernization charge against feminism. And I remember sitting there and feeling really aggravated, because while this argument is undoubtedly true that feminism is perceived across many post-colonial nations as something of a Western movement, the motion very specifically did not say the feminist movement. The motion said women's rights movements. And the complexity of what women's rights activism in India looks like is a lot more, it is quite different to just being able to call it feminism, because feminism implies a very specific Western characterization. I never got a chance to make a set of arguments that emerged out of the presumption on Prop that this policy affected Indian feminists. But nonetheless, you can see why a characterization like that might be quite important in terms of the specific group of people that you can talk about. So it's no longer just a small group of activists with a small set of interests, but a much larger and more complex and non-homogeneous group of actors. And finally, with respect to the words of the motion, usually when there are examples included in parentheses in the motion, try and think about whether there are any other examples you think that you wish to use or critique on, depending on which side you're on, and or whether or not you will include those examples. The reason why I say this is because obviously the easiest thing to do is just to say we'll defend the examples that were given on the motion slide or the info slide or whatever. But it is important to try and be aware of what else the debate might demand. So, for example, again, at a recent tournament, there was a motion on pride, any form of support from the establishment, so through corporate sponsorship or allowing political parties to march in pride and so on. And one of the first things my partner and I discussed during prep was whether the establishment, so those were the only two examples included, but whether the establishment might also include cops, and whether the motion would then require pride to to also say that they do not wish, that they would like to protest against a police presence at the march. Now, obviously, there is a very different set of arguments that emerges when you're just talking about Pride rejecting corporate sponsorship or not allowing political parties to march, versus if we also then have to defend Pride not supporting a police presence. And then, because it was less useful for our case to say the Pride would not want police presence, we did not talk about it. But very early in my PM speech, you just said, look, the specific kinds of examples we're defending are A, and B, and then said, I hope that sounds fair, and then hope that no one would call me out on it, and they didn't. But if you're on op, you may try to think about what other examples that may not have been included, or even the ones that might have been included, the ways in which it could damage the prop case, and therefore whether you want to include it as part of your case to talk about the harms of a particular policy. And finally, under this, in terms of your general checklist during prep, and I apologize, I think this is the longest section, so the rest of it will be briefer, is to identify your priorities in the debate, which is to say, what are the most important arguments that you think are absolutely vital for your team to place above all others in the debate? Or what is it that you think you must absolutely win in order to perform well? Now, the reason why this is important, obviously, is first of all, because of time allocation in terms of how much time you want to allocate across both speeches or one speech or whatever, in order to make that argument. The second, because of signaling, which is to say, how will you flag it up to the judges, or how will you use framing, for example, to make sure that that argument is front and center in the consciousness of the entirety of the judging panel, as well as becomes the most important thing in the debate. Remember that the less work that you make the judges do in terms of having to weigh up what was the most important thing in the debate, the better it is for your side, for your team, right? So in addition to this, you must also then try and identify what other material you're just going to use in order to bulk up your case, or that you can afford to sideline if you think you're running out of time, or you have forgotten a particular line of analysis that you now have to urgently respond to, etc. Basically, identify early on in prep what is the most important thing you think you need to win, and what is it that you think you can afford to either lose or concede, or you're happy for the argument to become marginalized. And make sure that in your speeches you are sensitive to this sense of prioritization. If you can't decide which of your, 17 arguments is the most important, try and pick one, or try and pick, sorry, not one, but try and pick sort of maybe 2 or 3 that you think is your most unique or your most powerful arguments, and spend more time on your framing, or coming up with framing that will make it seem as though this is the most important thing in the debate. This is particularly true for debates that are a bit woolly, or a bit, that might seem a bit low impact, or a bit, I believe the fashionable word is fluffy. So a lot of sort of debates about discourse, or debates about phenomena. It's very difficult to sometimes identify why you should care for a particular iteration of problems versus another. So if you can't decide what the standout, most impactful arguments are, spend time on framing in order to decide how you will make something seem like a very big deal. All right, let's very quickly now run through some specific things to bear in mind depending on where motions are slightly unusual, right? So the first one is, this is not a very unusual motion, but this is something to bear in mind, is if it's a regrets or a welcomes debate. So obviously there you're talking about the world is, and it's not really a policy that you can defend, and therefore you can't really do a lot of the things that I've mentioned so far. But what you the obvious thing to remember in regrets debates is that you have to posit the counterfactual, or what you think the world might look like if not for this particular phenomenon that you're regretting. The important thing to bear in mind during prep here is to think about the plausibility of that counterfactual. So, for example, at a tournament, I was in the motion. The final motion was, "This House regrets the demonization of the rich." And what we tried doing from Closing Government was to say that instead of demonizing the rich, what you should be doing is demonizing policies enacted by sort of but essentially policies that are enacted by particularly right-wing political parties that screw over the poor, so Republicans and Tories. And that was our counterfactual. And I do think there was some analysis, probably not enough, but hey. And I remember one of the responses from our opposing team was to say that this was not a plausible counterfactual, that instead what would happen is that if you didn't demonize the rich, you would demonize someone else who who is politically less powerful. So let's say immigrants for taking jobs, or something of that sort. Now look, both of these are characterizations, or they're hypothetical characterizations of what the world might look like if this particular thing, i.e. demonization of rich, didn't occur. Now, the way you win or lose that clash is to explain plausibility. So why is it that a natural channel for the rage that you might feel about economic inequality or unfairness might be to talk about the people who were structurally responsible for that inequality? Or would it be much more plausible to find an easier scapegoat, because that's a more immediate problem, right? As opposed to, I don't know, criticizing an amorphous set of policies. So these debates are won and lost on the basis of not just which counterfactual is intellectually appealing, but which one seems more plausible. So definitely make sure that when you are doing counterfactual analysis, that you are also doing plausibility analysis. The second kind of debate I want to talk about is a hypothetical debate, or a thought experiment debate, which are quite in vogue at the moment, and are generally really interesting because they allow you to discuss sort of complex philosophical or moral problems, and bypass some of the objections of, but this would never happen, right? So if it is a hypothetical debate, in addition to whatever else you do during prep time, here are a few things you absolutely must bear in mind. First of all, what are some reasonable assumptions you can make about a world in which this particular hypothesis is true? Which is to say, for example, if it's a debate about this house would prefer to live in a world where no one lies. Now, can you make arguments about, I think what you need to try and do there is, because say Op will talk about how sometimes your feelings might be hurt if you ask someone for advice or an opinion and they gave you a brutally honest answer rather than couched it or lied to you about it, or something of that sort. Now, the thing you want to do in Prop as well as in Op is to then say, if this is a world where no one ever lies, how do people behave in this world, right? Is there still an expectation that people will feel hurt by bluntness, for example, if that is what everybody does, and that is what everybody, and that the alternative is something that people are incapable of doing? And therefore, how can you neutralize a set of arguments that talks about people being upset or their self-esteem being damaged, etc., right? So definitely make sure that you try and think about the reasonable set of presumptions you can make about a world in which this is a continuing phenomenon. The second one is, how will people, and this is to do with say the kind of the happiness debate that I mentioned earlier, or another debate which is I think a variation of this is run in Malaysia Worlds, but has also been run in some other forms everywhere else. Sorry, not everywhere else, but in a lot of other places, which is should the state artificially increase empathy amongst its population, and what might the benefits of that be? When faced with a debate like that, where the state is artificially altering affect or altering a certain kind of behavior, what you might want to try and assess there is how will people now respond to this heightened good thing, right? So if suddenly you live in a world where you know that the state can make you happier, does that devalue happiness itself? Or will you just continue to reap the benefits of a happier population, for example? Or what might people do to counteract an artificial increase of empathy, for instance? So this is slightly connected to the point I mentioned above, which is in terms of reasonable presumptions you can make about the world. But this is a set of arguments you can derive, right? Which is to say, particularly in our position, where you say, look, just because the state is artificially transferring happiness does not actually mean that the state is able to guarantee that people will be happier, because now they know that this is, and now people know that this is not how this is, not natural happiness, whatever that means, right? So that's something you need to bear in mind. The third thing I will say, and this is a really silly, tiny little thing, but it can be so vital in terms of constructing argumentation in debates like this, is if it's a state will do, hypothetical thing X, or sorry, a lot of debates are hypothetical in that sense, but state will do can't really happen in the real world thing X. Is particularly in opening government, if you want this policy to be a secret, so will people know that their happiness levels will be artificially increased or decreased? What are the implications of this? Will it make the effects more potent if people don't realize that the increase is artificial? But are there legitimacy concerns about that? Do you care about those legitimacy concerns, etc.? Very good to early on make sure that you're not, you don't leave the debate you don't consign it to the kind of mess that occurs later down when people just say, oh, but what if they know, what if they don't know, etc. And obviously, if you're not the team that gets to decide whether or not the policy is secret, then the reason why this is important is because it might allow you to come up with a set of arguments that are specific to that expectation of secrecy. I'm going to quickly check if there are any comments. I don't suspect there are, but okay, we have a question. Can you please also include how many minutes do you spend teamwork, case impacting, comparative framing, etc.? Yes, okay, I think that's a really good question. Okay, I'll get to that. I'll get to that now, actually. I think a lot of this depends on what exactly your team dynamics are. But I would say probably spend a couple of minutes trying to come up with the opposition's case. Well, I'll say the things that you should definitely spend your time on, and then prioritize and reprioritize according to how your team works. Definitely spend some time coming up with the strongest possible material on the opposing side, irrespective of the kind of motion it is. If you are top half, definitely leave enough time at the end. So I'd say about maybe 2 minutes to 3 minutes to make sure that your speech is written down, so you have everything that you need to do. Sometime in the middle of this, you should come up with a mechanism if you're in opening government, and obviously not if you don't have to worry about that. But don't spend too long on it. I think the simpler the mechanism, the better, very often. I think what you need to do is to spend the most amount of time on things that are going to be contentious, right? So if everyone would broadly agree about what the problem is that you're trying to solve, spend less time coming up with that and a lot more time coming up with how the policy will change that set of problems. So I definitely say so if you say 2 minutes to come up with the opposing side's case and 1 minute to come up with mech and about 2 or 3 minutes to write your own speech. Gone, right, in opening government. So you want to be able to make sure that you're spending the rest of the time very, very carefully. So don't spend too long on maybe like a minute on what you think the status quo is and all the characterization of the status quo. Spend a lot of time coming up with the comparative. So maybe a solid, I don't know, 3 minutes on comparative analysis. But again, a lot of this will depend on what you think your team dynamics are, as well as where in the debate you're located. I would definitely say that the most important thing you want to do is very early on in prep time, try and identify what you think are the most important arguments in the debate, and then to spend the most amount of time on that. But essentially, with, say, the checklist or the toolkit that I gave you early on, try and think about basically which bits of it you need to prioritize on and spend sort of say 2 to 3 minutes on each of those. And a lot of other things will be much simpler, so you can fill in the blanks yourself, while writing your speech, for example, or don't come up with like, if they say X, then we will say Y, and then we will say Z. So don't spend a lot of time coming up with overly detailed possible responses, but make sure, in case those objections are never raised, but make sure that you do anticipate the strongest lines of attack against your case and spend most time on that. All right, so finally, in terms of the kind of debate that I want to talk about, and this one is very close to my heart, not because I like them, but because I really hate them. So this is about fact-heavy motions, or motions that require you to have a lot of spec knowledge. The reason why I say this in terms of what to do during prep time is, look, you may well be the kind of team that just knows all the facts or that has an incredible amount of info. And that's certainly something that can be quite, that is often very, very helpful. If you are that kind of team, then the obvious pitfall I'd ask you to be wary of, and this will obviously depend on different kinds of, different speakers have different expertise on different topics, etc. If you know a lot about the motion, always bear in mind that the things you're saying are relevant to the argument that you're making, and it's not just descriptive fluff that you're adding in order to sound impressive. Or, I mean, you can do a little bit of that. I suppose a little bit is fine, but more importantly, you're not just dumping information without tying it back to specific, clear lines of argumentation that you can then reconnect to the motion at hand, rather than just information that you think is helpful just because in and of itself, right? If you're not the kind of team that, or if you've identified areas where you are lacking on the information, obviously in the run up to an international, obviously spend some time doing matter prep and so on. But specifically during prep, and I mean, there's very little you can do about learning new information during prep, right? So what I want to talk about is what to do with the information that you have available. The first thing I would say is, let's say you're a team that has done, a lot of matter prep and has been very conscientious in terms of how much you have researched on, all of the different trade blocks and all of the different treaties and all of the different conflict zones currently, etc. The most important thing to bear in mind, and this is something you need to do ahead, is to have a case file that is easy to navigate. It is next to impossible to try and sift through a massive case file with pages and pages of essay-length material on a complicated conflict in order to search for one tiny nugget of information that you can then weaponize into an argument. So make sure that the case file that you have constructed is one that is conducive to actually being able to be used during prep time. So this is something that happens before the debate. And also be aware of how you will use the case file in a specific debate. But let's say you don't have any facts. So hopefully you won't be in a situation where you don't know anything about the debate. But let's say you don't know enough about the debate. Read through the wording of the motion carefully. See if that you have any proximate information that might be relevant to any part of the specifics of a particular conflict. But do you know anything about the way the actor that you have to talk about has behaved in the past, or has, or what is happening in that country at the moment, and how that might affect political will towards having a particular or towards performing a certain action, etc. For example, I remember being in a debate where it was about, I think, the US supporting the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, and this is in 2015. Now, obviously, that's a very complex conflict, and there are lots of moving parts to that conflict. But what I remember from that debate is, even if there are specifics about the Saudi-led coalition that you don't know a lot about, there are still ways in which, if you have information about either the way the US has historically behaved in terms of conflict resolution, or in terms of what is going on in Yemen at the moment, that you can use in order to construct a fairly solid case. Now, obviously, the more information you have about this, the better. But even if you have very little information, try and think about arguments you can make that are specific to that particular actor that you can use in order to come up with at least a decent set of arguments, right? Obviously, if you're in bottom half, try and come up with arguments. I mean, it's a bit easier if you're in bottom half and you don't know facts, because to some extent you can fill in the blanks when top half is talking. But more importantly, remember that you want to be able to make arguments that rely on plausible characterizations on, if not every part of the debate, at least some parts of the debate. This is obviously not ideal, but as someone who's never been very good with, I don't know, information-heavy debates, I do think that, well, in prep time, you should have just matter prepped better. Here is what you do if you haven't and still want to make a decent case out of it. But obviously also matter prep, because that's really important. Alternatively, with a lot of IR debates, for instance, do you know anything about the region at all that you might be able to deploy in order to make these arguments? And bear in mind earlier that I said, just because a country is, even sometimes geographically proximate, it doesn't mean that you can wholesale adapt or transfer one set of analysis that applies to one country to another. But familiarity with the region, even if not with the specific conflict or with a specific country, is quite important, because you're able to make certain deductions about the stability of the region, the interests of the region, what the other key players in the region are. So, for example, if it's a debate about regretting the rising nationalism in Japan, then it would help you if you knew the specifics of who's in power in Japan at the moment, what has their history of nationalism been, how specifically it is being enacted at the moment. But also bear in mind that you can make a lot of relevant arguments if you're broadly familiar with the South China Sea conflict, if you're familiar with the US presence in the region, if you're familiar with the kind of belligerence that, say, specific countries might be posing at the moment, and so on and so forth. So basically draw from a broad base of arguments as far as possible. And finally, always remember to always remember to make arguments that are based on the principled reasons behind doing or not doing something. So obviously, a principled case, if done badly, can be ineffectual, but nonetheless ought to be done well. When it is done well, can be very persuasive. So, for example, if it's a debate about an intervention, and even if you know all the facts, it's still important to try and talk about the legitimacy of that intervention or the illegitimacy of it, or how interventions have historically been conducted and why they're good, why they're bad, etc. For example, this is, gosh, I've only ever heard of this motion. It was the first time I'd ever done a BP debate. The motion was about Australia forcibly democratizing Fiji. And I'd never done BP before, and I just knew very, very little about what was going on. And it was just such a bewildering motion to be faced with. And I remember what the judge told me as I just stared blankly. Sorry, this was in the context of a trial, so it wasn't at a tournament. Think about the words of the motion, think about what forcibly democratizing a country might mean. And obviously then there is a set of arguments you can draw out of that. So bearing in mind that these are some things you can do even if you don't have enough information, but ideally you will have some. So very quickly, a lot of the things that I've said so far can be adapted specifically for top or bottom half. But here I will just very rapidly dash through some of the things that you might want to do specifically in top half and in bottom half. As I mentioned earlier, in top half, make sure that you are characterizing the problem, the policy, as well as the impacts, and very, very importantly, that you are characterizing the exclusivity of that policy in solving that particular problem, and that's really important. You will have already identified the costs associated with this policy. What you might also want to discuss is how you're likely to present it in your case. As in, will you flag it up early on and minimize it, or will you only bring, if it has been raised in the first place? Will you mitigate those costs? Will you just accept them? What is it that you want to do with them? On op, there are a set of standard things you can do, which is you can dispute that the problem exists, which is probably less of a good idea because a motion wouldn't have been said if there's no problem at all. But what you might dispute more effectively is A, the scale of the problem, or B, the efficacy of the policy in solving that problem. So is it illegitimate? Does it not address the totality of the problem? Is it ineffective, etc.? What you also want to do in op is to talk about any unintended consequences or negative consequences that might emerge even if government is able to achieve everything that they say they will. Now, bearing in mind, don't make this the entirety of your op case, because that's the test of the government bench. But do have a section where you talk about, even if it is true that this policy can solve this particular version of the problem, here is a set of additional harms that emerge out of it. This is particularly visible when you talk about intervention debates, where you say, even if you're successful in resolving the conflict right now, here is how it might emerge, here is how there are long-term problems and fissures that might emerge as a result of this particular intervention. So essentially, you want to be able to identify the legitimacy of a policy or the illegitimacy, the efficacy through a set of gestures that say, here are a number of things you would need to solve in order to actually address the problem. So basically what you do is to say why this particular policy is not effective in solving the problem, right? Usually I would say for government that you have, if you're an OG, work on your MEC sometime in the middle of the speech. Don't leave it until the very end, because that's when you forget and panic. But once, basically, what outcomes you want to achieve, the MEC can be a useful way, a useful conceptualization of the MEC is as an instrument that allows you to attach the benefits you want to the policy that you have to do. So I personally don't like coming up with the MEC absolutely at the beginning, because that's when you haven't fully anticipated all the lines of attacks you might get. So it's usually somewhere in the middle or slightly later during prep time. And obviously remember to leave enough time for the first speaker to actually construct their speech. In bottom half, it's usually very difficult to say our extension will be this. So what you want to do is to try and come up with as many lines of analysis as possible, and therefore to see which of those you want to prioritize, and which of those you think are less useful, as well as to be able to renegotiate that if OG or OO have taken all the most useful, impactful stuff. The one thing I'll say if you're prepping for bottom half is if you think there are certain arguments that are so basic that OG will definitely run them, write them down anyway, because top half is also trying to think of what creative lines of argumentation bottom half might come up with. So very often they will forget some really basic lines of analysis. So it might be really useful for you to have those things written down. Another thing that I quite like doing in bottom half is to almost draw sort of like a map of actors, so like the cluster of people who you could speak about potentially in this debate, as well as a timeline analysis of how you think the policy or whatever the debate is situated in the short term versus the long term. Because essentially what you're trying to do is in which you can derive an extension based on the material that you hear over the course of the debate once top half have spoken. The final thing I want to talk about is how to work with your partner groups, particularly in the context of an international, but a lot of this is generally useful information. Bearing in mind that I think sometimes even less so than in the actual debate, prep time is where your team dynamics can make or break your performance in the round. It's a very high pressured 15 minutes. You want to try and do so many things. You want to get to the room in time, and all of the above. So it's really important to be able to clarify your understanding of how your team works under different situations, and therefore how best you can handle prep time with your partner. This is the single most useful thing I think I have done in any international I've spoken in, which is genuinely, I think, helped me even more than the time I've spent matter prepping in a way, because debates are won and lost often not on the basis of who knows the most information, but who is able to most persuasively, in the context of a changing debate, make their arguments impactful and is able to produce a cohesive and a coherent case across two speakers. And a lot of that is down to how you work with your partner. And prep time will expose those vulnerabilities quite severely if you don't spend some time working on it. The first thing I will say is different people have different strengths, right? Both during the debate as well as before the debate during prep. Early on, identify those strengths and weaknesses that you and your partner have and come up with a system that allows you to adapt to those strengths and weaknesses during prep time. So for example, is one of you particularly good with generating a volume of argumentation? Is the other person much better at coming up with strategic decisions about weighing or about framing or about making material impactful? In which case, it might be better for the first person to lead prep, whereas the other person functions not as a passive listener, but as someone who is constantly weaponizing the volume of material being generated. The other thing you want to make sure you do is that you're constantly aware when someone is coming up with an argument, you're constantly coming up also with ways in which you actually make that argument impactful and that you're tying it back to the motion. So something might be a really interesting or an intellectually riveting argument, but how is it that you will tie back to the motion at hand? And if it's sometimes difficult for the person who's actually generating the argument to hold that in perspective, so then your partner should be doing this for you. The other thing I would say is during prep, if there is something that you don't understand your partner, if you don't document, ask them to explain it to you again. The reason being that if you're finding it difficult to understand it in prep, it is probably going to be difficult to explain it to a judge and to other teams when they have other things that they care about in the debate, right? Make sure that you are able to adapt to each other's strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, do both of you find a certain line of argumentation really persuasive, which makes you, less vigilant of other lines of argumentation? A common example of this is that very often, right-wing arguments don't get brought up during prep a lot, or non-liberal arguments don't get brought up. So be aware of each other's biases, explain the argument, as well as each other's lines of thinking, right? So make sure that you are being honest, but usefully communicative during prep if you don't understand something. In terms of matter generation, I'm never someone who takes the lead during prep because I'm bad at generating volume of material. I'm a much more my strengths are much more strategic as a speaker, so much better at doing weighing or framing and the rest of it. But if either you are someone who is very good at generating material, or if you're a team where both people are very good at generating material, bear in mind that you are not dismissing each other's ideas, out of hand. It's okay to take the lead. Very often it is productive and very often naturally in some debates, one partner takes the lead and the other partner takes the lead. But make sure that you're not dismissing the other person in a bid to generate a great degree of volume. It is never a good team dynamic where one person is trying to say something and the other person just says that's not relevant, or that doesn't make any sense. It's much better to say, can you explain to me how we will tie it to this particular part of the motion, or can you tell me how this ties to that particular concern, etc. And this is a repetition of something I've said before. Definitely make sure that one of you at least is constantly reminding your team of what the strongest response to a particular argument is. So if you've come up with a really good argument, then at least one person in the team needs to say, okay, and what if op say this? Or what if the judge finds this unpersuasive because of X? And in doing so, you can help build, plug gaps in your case. The important thing to do is matter distribution. This is particularly true for top half more than bottom half, which is, say, you might have identified 5 areas where the arguments are located. Be very, very clear about who does which bit, what you think might be necessary for the DPM or the DLO to do, and the order in which you want to prioritize the argument so that the second speaker can maybe reverse the order or whatever. And finally, I will say that it is important while it is important to bear in mind any common errors that you make as a team, or something that has gone wrong in a previous round that you want to fix, be very careful that you don't use prep time as the battlefield in which you try and allocate blame. So what you want to try and do is essentially, just as you might find it helpful to have a checklist of things to do during prep, also have a checklist of things to remember to do based on the previous rounds you have. So if you just say focus on weighing, or remember to impact X, or remember to tie it back to the motion, or whatever. Debating is a team sport. It is very rare that an individual wins or loses the debate entirely on their own accord. Prep time is not where you allocate that blame. What you want to do is to try and say, we must be aware of this, or use that better still to inform the lines of argumentation you're running. So if you're a team that has forgotten to do, adequate weighing in the previous round, or adequate description, or whatever else it is, or you've missed an actor entirely, just take a step back and say, are we doing it again? Are we missing any lines of analysis, etc.? And I know I said finally, I lied. 2 more things. The first is, even more so than any other intervarsity or open you will attend, just because of sheer numbers, an international is the time it might take you to get from the announcement room to your venue is complicated by the fact that there are so many people around, and that you might often have to travel a much greater distance between, announcement and main room and room of the debate. So you might not be able to almost immediately find a comfortable place to sit down and get cracking, right? So the question then is, what is it that how best can you use prep time when you are walking amidst a horde of people and trying desperately to find your room, or you're in a crowded lift where there are 8 teams crammed? One of the things that I often find is that it's very useful when you don't actually have the time to write. You're not able to write anything down because you're moving. Is to try and orally discuss, even if you're not able to make notes, what the opposing case is, and therefore what you need to bear in mind, and to try and begin thinking of, and to try and take some time, or for example, you can use this time to, to take a minute or so to individually prep to try and see what you might say in the debate, because then you can combine whatever individually you have come up with, right? So there are certain strategic decisions you might have to make about how best you're going to use the time where you're not able to take notes down. And the other thing that I will say is that because there are only 3 rounds per day at an international during the in rounds, there is a lot of time to stew between rounds, to sort of obsess over mistakes or to be frustrated or whatever. That's fine. I mean, that's on you, on how you want to deal with it. You need to be able to find a way to get in the zone very quickly when prep time starts. So that's what you need to bear in mind as soon as the draw goes up, right? To forget about the points you're on and the rest of it. To also not sort of try and think in terms of, oh, there are those teams we can beat, we can't beat those other teams, etc. Those are not feelings you want to carry into a prep round. Never be the team that is just trying to avoid the 4th, that is just happy to be there. Go into prep time with the knowledge that irrespective of what has happened before, you're going to give it your best shot. Particularly important for closed rounds, because with rounds 8 and 9, there is furious backtabbing. And, it can be devastating to find out that you took a 4th in the previous round, and that means that now you're in a very difficult position for the break or whatever else. There will be plenty of time to, arrange those regrets and those sadnesses. Go into prep without thinking about any of that, without thinking about, oh, we need to take a second, or we need to absolutely avoid a 4th. The point at which you're beginning to say things like that, you focus less on the debate at hand and more on being hyper aware of everything that can go wrong in an unproductive fashion. So it doesn't matter if you've taken a 4th in the previous round. It doesn't matter if you are worried about the room you're in, or you don't know how many points you're on, or you've just had a really disastrous outing. During prep time, just focus on the task at hand, and just use prep time clinically. Don't bring in frustrations into prep. Just keep them. Just the amount of time you have between rounds to stew on such things, and don't bring them into prep, and do whatever it takes for you to get in the zone just before prep. So effectively, you're ready to hit the ground running when the timer starts. So that's all I have to say. I'm quickly going to check if there is one question, which is, what should you do if you're struggling to come up with a unique extension in prep time? You can do several things. I don't know at what point of time this question was sent, so if this was before or after I did the section on how to prep for an extension. How to prep for bottom half. But if you're struggling to come up with a unique extension in prep time, well, first of all, don't worry about it, right? You won't know whether or not your extension is unique in prep time because you don't know what the other team is going to say. But some things you can definitely do are one, almost draw a map of the different actors who might, or affected parties. So essentially try and think about all the different groups of people you could potentially talk about and why you think those groups are important. The second thing is obviously a timeline analysis, where can you talk about what happens right now versus what happens in the future, and how will you make either of these things most important? The third thing you can do is to think about the framing that wins or loses the debate, which is to say that even if opening take all the material that you want to run, ideally as you're prepping, what is the most important bit of framing you can do in order to make the powerful argument powerful, right? So this is what I said earlier about prioritization. So obviously the risk with, well, obviously the occupational hazard of being a second half team is that you don't know if there will be enough material left over for an extension. But it is very difficult for a top half team, once two top half teams have spoken, for you to have nothing new at all to say. So don't panic, really. Just try and think of as many lines of argument as possible. And if you think you can only think of two arguments and you're absolutely sure that top half will take all of them, bear in mind that you can always reframe rebuttal as an extension. So try not to panic about it. So essentially, what you want to do is to try and construct areas in which the argument might be located, rather than to say, here is a definite argument. My first point is going to be A, my second point is going to be B. That's never going to help with bottom half. So just try and identify as many areas as possible where arguments might be located. Let's see. I think that's all. And yep, so no more questions. So I will stop there, and I hope that was helpful. And if you're going to Euros, good luck, and I hope to see you there. If not, I hope this was useful in terms of general international prep, or just in terms of general debating prep. So goodbye and good luck.